They were young, they were hopeful, they were ready for an adventure. They boarded the plane with their rugby teammates, their families, their friends. They expected to land in Santiago, Chile in a few hours. They never imagined that they would end up in the middle of the Andes, fighting for their lives. This is the story of the survivors of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571, a plane that crashed in the Andes Mountains on October 13, 1972. The flight was carrying 45 passengers and crew, including 19 members of the Old Christians Club rugby union team, along with their families, supporters, and friends. They were on their way from Montevideo, Uruguay, to Santiago, Chile, for a friendly match. But due to bad weather, the plane had to stop in Mendoza, Argentina, and wait for clearance to cross the Andes. The inexperienced co-pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Dante Hector Lagurara, was at the controls when the accident occurred. He mistakenly believed the plane had reached Curicó, where the flight would turn to descend into Pudahuel Airport, but failed to notice that instrument readings indicated he was still 60-70 kilometers from the city. As he began to descend, the plane struck a mountain, shearing off both the wings and the tail section. The remaining portion of the fuselage slid down a glacier at an estimated 350 kilometers per hour and descended about 725 meters before crashing into ice and snow. Of the 45 people on the aircraft, 3 passengers and 2 crew members in the tail section were killed instantly. The survivors were left in a state of shock, pain, and confusion. They had no radio, no map, no compass, and no survival equipment. They only had a small amount of food, mostly chocolate, wine, and cheese, which they rationed carefully. They also had a transistor radio, which they used to listen to the news and music. They soon learned that the authorities had flown over the crash site several times, searching for the aircraft, but could not see the white fuselage against the snow. Search efforts were cancelled after 8 days, leaving the survivors with the devastating realization that they were on their own. The survivors faced many challenges and dangers in their harsh environment. The temperature dropped to -30 degrees Celsius at night, and they had no proper clothing or insulation. They suffered from frostbite, hypothermia, dehydration, altitude sickness, and infections. They also had to cope with the psychological trauma of losing their loved ones, witnessing their deaths, and burying their bodies in the snow. They prayed, sang, played games, and told stories to keep their spirits up. They also organized themselves into a hierarchy, with the team captain, Marcelo Perez, as the leader, and assigned tasks and responsibilities to each member. They tried to maintain hygiene, discipline, and morale, despite the desperate situation, but the most difficult and controversial decision they had to make was whether to resort to cannibalism. After exhausting their meager food supply, they realized that their only source of nourishment was the corpses of their dead companions. They debated the ethical and religious implications of this act, and some initially refused to participate, but they eventually agreed that it was a matter of survival, and that their friends would have wanted them to live. They rationalized that they were not killing anyone, but only using what was already dead. They also saw it as a way of honoring and keeping their friends alive in their memories. They cut small pieces of flesh from the bodies and ate them raw or cooked them on a metal sheet over a fire. They also used the bones to make soup. They avoided eating the faces, hands, and feet, and preserved the hearts and brains for the relatives of the deceased. The survivors also made several attempts to escape from the mountains and find help. They explored their surroundings and discovered that they were on the eastern side of the Andes, in Argentina, near the border with Chile. They also found the tail section of the plane, which contained some batteries, wires, magazines, and clothes. They used these items to improvise a heater, a stove, a sun visor, and a sleeping bag. They also tried to use the batteries and wires to send a distress signal, but failed. They then decided to send a group of 3 men to climb a nearby peak and look for signs of civilization. They hoped to find a road, a village, or a river that would lead them to safety. They prepared for the expedition by making snowshoes, sunglasses, and sleeping bags. They also selected the strongest and fittest members of the group, Nando Parado, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio Tintin Vizintin. The 3 men set off on December 12, 1972, carrying a small amount of food and water and a sleeping bag. They faced many obstacles and dangers such as steep slopes, deep crevasses, strong winds, and avalanches. They also had to endure hunger, thirst, fatigue, and cold. They climbed for 3 days until they reached the summit of the peak, which was 4,650 meters high. They expected to see the green valleys of Chile, but to their dismay, they only saw more mountains. They realized that they had crossed the continental divide and that they were still far from civilization. They felt hopeless and defeated, but they decided to continue their journey, hoping to find a way out. They descended from the peak and followed a river valley that led them to the west. They encountered a herd of cows, which they killed and ate. They also found some signs of human activity, such as fences, bridges, and tracks. They followed these clues until they reached a meadow where they saw a man on horseback. They tried to get his attention, but he did not see them. They then decided to send Parado and Canessa ahead, while Vizintin stayed behind with the sleeping bag and the food. Parado and Canessa ran after the man and finally caught up with him. They asked him for help and told him their story. The man, Sergio Catalan, was a Chilean arriero, or muleteer, who was working in the area. He was shocked and amazed by what he heard, and he offered them food and shelter. He also told them that he would alert the authorities and that they would be rescued soon. The next day, December 22, 1972, Parado and Canessa were flown by helicopter to a nearby town, where they received medical attention and were reunited with their families. They also gave the coordinates of the crash site and asked for the rescue of the other survivors. The helicopter flew to the site but could not land due to the terrain and the weather. It dropped some food and supplies and a note that read, "We come back tomorrow." The survivors were overjoyed and relieved and celebrated their imminent rescue. The next day, December 23, 1972, the helicopter returned and picked up 6 of the survivors. It then came back for a second trip and picked up the remaining 8 survivors, including Vizintin. After 72 days of isolation and hardship, the 16 survivors of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 were finally saved. The rescue of the survivors was a worldwide sensation and attracted a lot of media attention and public interest. The survivors were hailed as heroes and received a warm welcome from their country and their community. They also faced a lot of curiosity and scrutiny, especially about their practice of cannibalism. They initially denied it, but later admitted it and explained their reasons and feelings. They received mixed reactions, ranging from admiration and sympathy to criticism and condemnation. They also had to deal with the aftermath of the tragedy and the impact it had on their lives. They suffered from physical and psychological problems, such as injuries, illnesses, nightmares, flashbacks, and depression. They also had to cope with the loss of their friends and relatives and the guilt and grief they felt. They sought support from each other, their families, their faith, and their therapists. They also tried to resume their normal lives and pursued their careers, education, and hobbies. Some of them got married, had children, and wrote books. Some of them also became involved in humanitarian and social causes, such as helping the poor, the sick, and the oppressed. They also maintained a close bond with each other and with the families of the deceased. They held reunions, anniversaries, and memorial services to commemorate and honor their experience and their friends. The story of the survivors of Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571 is a remarkable and inspiring one that shows the power of the human spirit, the strength of the human will, and the value of the human life. It is a story of survival, courage, and resilience in the face of adversity, horror, and despair. It is a story of friendship, loyalty, and sacrifice among a group of people who shared a common fate, a common struggle, and a common hope. It is a story of faith, hope, and love that transcended the boundaries of life and death, and that gave meaning and purpose to their existence. It is a story that challenges us to reflect on our own lives.